3 steps by which we can reduce this general gap between our values and our behavior. So step number 1 is going to be understanding the nature of the gap, understanding why this gap is so common. Why is it that it's such a common phenomenon that if we have our values, why is it so common that we behave out of line with our values? Step number 2 is going to be to understand, based on the conceptual basis of this gap, to come up with a conceptual way to bridge the gap, and then to take that concept of how to bridge the gap and actually translate it into a real strategy about how we can actually put that into action and really start taking tangible steps to bridge that gap and to bring our behavior closer and closer to our values, so that the life we live will reflect our values more accurately, and we'll feel healthier, we'll feel more fulfilled, we'll feel happier, we'll feel more confident, we'll have more self-respect. And the benefits of that to our, first of all, literally to our physiological health, certainly to our mental and emotional well-being, and to our quality of life, are, I would say, cannot be overstated. How much we can improve and improve our well-being by bringing our behavior more in line with our values. So step number 1 is understanding the nature of the gap, where the gap comes from, and why it's so common. And I would say that to a large degree, what this boils down to is the difference between our mind and our heart. And I say heart figuratively. The gap between knowledge, understanding what we know, what we think, and the way we feel. Because generally the thing that has the most immediate impact on behavior, the thing that drives behavior most immediately, the thing that immediately affects what we're going to do, our actions, is our feelings, right? We feel something, we feel inclined to do something, we're likely to do it. We feel a desire, we feel an interest in something, we're likely to do it. If we have a conceptual academic understanding of the value of something, we might do it, and that, has a number of pathways by which it'll affect the likelihood of us doing it, and we'll get to that. But if we feel that something's valuable, we're a lot more likely to take action and to do it than if we just think or know or understand that it's valuable, right? Feelings drive behavior immediately. And by immediately, I don't mean in time. I mean, it's the closest thing. The closest thing that drives behavior and action is feelings, the way we feel. And, we don't always feel the way we should based on what we know. Sometimes we know that something's important and we value it highly in our minds. And if you'd ask me, what my values are, I'd say my values are A, B, and C. But in terms of my feelings, I really want other things. I'm interested in other things. I'm engaged by other things. I'm attracted to other things. And that's going to be those feelings are going to be a very powerful force in driving my behavior towards those things, rather than towards what I know and believe to be truly valuable. So because, our mind and our heart, our thoughts and our feelings are separate things that, happen independently in different parts of our consciousness, and our behavior is most immediately driven by our feelings. If our feelings are out of sync, out of line with our values and our beliefs, it's likely that our behavior could end up, our behavior could realistically end up out of line with our beliefs and our values, because it's driven by our feelings most immediately. Now, we can, this doesn't mean that we're doomed to just act based on how we feel, obviously, and we'll get to that. But generally speaking, naturally, we're most inclined, all things being equal, to behave based on what we feel more seamlessly than based on what we think. So the gap, I guess maybe we can put it this way, the gap between our values and beliefs and our behavior, if there is such a gap, is probably to a large degree, let's say, a result of the gap between our minds and our hearts, between our thoughts and our feelings. So step 2 is going to be, right, what was step 2? How to bridge that gap conceptually, to come up with the concept. If we understand conceptually where that gap comes from, if the gap between values and behavior comes from the gap between our thoughts and our feelings, our minds and our hearts, then in parallel with that concept, the way to build that bridge is going to be to find a way. What we need to achieve is to align our hearts with our mind, to align our feelings with our values, And if we can find a way, find a pathway to get our feelings to match our values and our beliefs, that's going to start to drive our behavior to be more in line with our values and our beliefs. Because look, the fact is, as I said a minute ago, we are not doomed to behaving according to our feelings, right? Any healthy, mature person on a relatively regular basis is going to be exercising self-control and behaving based on what we know we're supposed to do rather than just what we feel like, how we feel. We are capable of exerting that self-control and behaving in line with our values and beliefs against our feelings when necessary. But the bottom line is, every time we have to do that, it takes effort. And which means, number one, to make that our approach. If we, to say that, well, I want to live a life that's in line with my feelings. So every time I feel something that's different to my values and my beliefs, I'm going to just have self-control and go against, the tide of my feelings and do what I'm supposed to do. As a long-term strategy, that's, it's high risk, because every time we have to do that, it takes a lot of effort and we're not perfect. And the larger the number of times we have to, have self-control to fight our feelings to behave in line with our values, the higher the likelihood that there's going to be, numerous instances of our behaving in ways that are not aligned with our values. Because to successfully exert that self-control every single time on an ongoing basis takes a lot of effort. It takes repeated effort, and on an ongoing basis, it's very demanding, and it's going to take a toll, and it's not a stable or reliable approach. Just to say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, have self-control, be an adult, just behave according to your values despite the fact that your feelings drive you to behave otherwise is, look, if that's the only option we have, then that's what we've got to do as mature people. But, it's very obviously not ideal as a long-term strategy, because it's relatively high risk in terms of the likelihood of us, pulling that off successfully every time. It's very demanding. It's going to start to take a real toll. So, but, we do want, and it is important and very valuable to align our behavior with our values, because, as I mentioned earlier, when our behavior is out of line with our values, misaligned with our values, it takes a toll. It doesn't make us feel good. It's not good for our well-being. So if we can find a good, effective, lower maintenance, lower risk, less demanding strategy to really successfully and effectively get our behavior in line with our values, that's going to be a much better approach. And such an approach does exist, right? So conceptually, what we want to try to do is to find a way to shift our feelings and to bring them in line with our values. And if we can shift our feelings as a whole, if we can take our feelings and shift them to bring them in line with our values, then our behavior is naturally going to fall more in line with our values. And on an ongoing basis, as a result of that shift, our behavior is naturally going to be better aligned with our beliefs and our values. And that's going to lead to less tension, greater self-respect and self-love, and a greater sense of satisfaction and fulfillment and confidence and, all of these things. So, and finding a way to get our feelings to be better aligned with our beliefs, that's the magic bullet. And once we can find a way to make that happen broadly, to really realign our feelings with our values, that can really, and it might sound like a bit of an overstatement, but I really don't think it is. That can cause a huge shift in the course of our lives. It can cause a huge shift in our behavior and a huge shift in our well-being and our sense of fulfillment. So the question then is, step number 3. So step number 1 was understanding where this gap comes from. And, that's the gap between our thoughts, our knowledge, and our feelings, which results in a gap between our values and our behavior. Step number 2 is understanding conceptually at least, a good approach to bridging that gap. And the best approach to bridging the gap between our values and our behavior is going to be to find a way, if we can, to bridge the gap between our mind and our heart, between our thoughts, our knowledge, what we think, what we know, what we believe, and the way we feel. If we can bridge that gap, reduce that gap, really what we want to do is not bridge the gap, but actually reduce, ideally eliminate, but maybe that's pushing it, but we very realistically can drastically reduce that gap. And as we reduce the gap between our beliefs and our values and our feelings, we'll reduce the gap between our values and our behavior. So now we're up to step 3, which is a practical strategy to build that bridge, or not to bridge the gap. Again, better than bridging the gap is to reduce the gap. And this can be achieved very effectively because feelings are very malleable. Feelings change. Feelings, can be bent and reshaped. And our feelings, sometimes our feelings can shift on a dime. But, our basic fundamental feelings, not just shifting from one to another, but the real nature of our feelings, it can change. And it does change. I'm sure that every one of us, if we reflect for a minute, will see that our feelings have changed over time. Number one, as we've grown and matured, and number two, throughout life. There are a number of things, and I would say maybe really 3 things I would say that influence our feelings, let's say, right? Number one is going to be our nature. Number 2 is going to be our minds. Number 3 is going to be our environment and circumstances, right? So number 1 is our nature. Our genes, our genetic makeup, our physiological makeup, the physical makeup of our brains, the way that we're hardwired, is going to have a very large say in the way we feel about things. A very large say. That's number 1. But that we can't do anything about. We can't change our genes, we can't change our nature. So that is what it is. But there are 2 more things that have substantial input into our feelings, and those are things that we can address. So, I'm going to elaborate for a second on what I said was number 3, because that's, I would say, second priority, and then come back to number 2, which is priority number 1. So the third thing I mentioned was environment, our experiences, our circumstances, right? Everything we experience affects our feelings, right? If you see someone get hurt, for example, the thing that hurt that person, especially if it's someone close to you, is going to change the way you feel about that thing because it hurt someone you love, etc. And the same would be the opposite. If you see someone help someone you love, the way you feel towards that person is going to change. So our environment, our experiences, our circumstances, all of those things are going to affect the way we feel about things. And there are things we can do about that. We have a degree of control over our circumstances. The people we interact with, the people we hang around a lot, have a very big influence on how we feel. And if there are people who are maybe, being not such a good influence over the way we feel, and they're, driving our feelings out of sync with our values, it might be a good idea to change, to be intentional and maybe change who we spend time around, and, who we allow the right to influence the way we feel. If the people that are, influencing our feelings at the moment are doing us a disservice by, increasing the gap between our values and our feelings. And people, acquaintances, friends, etc. is one part of that environment and circumstances, and, the places we go, the things we're involved in, etc. And, we might have varying degrees of realistic ability to change those things. But something that also has a massive influence over our feelings, over the way we feel, that we have a lot of control over. In some ways, it's more difficult to exert this control, but at the same time, we have, if we're prepared to do the work and to step up to the plate, we have a very large degree of control over this second, category of influences over our feelings. And that's our minds. Information, learning, becoming familiar with things, right? The more we know about something, the better informed our disposition towards it, our feelings towards it are going to be, right? We can't control our nature. We can control our environment to some degree, but we can control, number 1, what we know by learning, by seeking information. We can control what we think about. Right? It takes effort. It's a lot easier to just sit and relax and let thoughts run through our minds, but we all know how that, where that can end up, and it's not always going to be good for us, to say the least. And we can, to a very large degree, probably almost completely, if we want to, control what we think about and control the thoughts that we entertain with our minds. So I would say that it really makes sense to make that the focus of our practical strategy. If we want to be able to live a life that's seamless, where our behavior is continuous, is on a continuum with our values. We have values, we have beliefs. Our behavior and the life that we live, the way we behave, the way we interact with people, the way we live our lives really reflects those values. And the benefits of this cannot be overstated. If we want to achieve that, and we can, the thing that it really makes sense to focus on and to put our effort into is our thoughts, is what we know and what we think about. And focusing on the mind can give us a strategy that can really very comprehensively address the issue. And by, being intentional with our minds, being intentional what we learn, being intentional about what we think about and how we think and what we think, can, I would say, realistically over time have a just about completely close that gap. If you haven't yet, click on the subscribe button, then click on the notification bell to see future videos. And please, again, share the link wherever you share things on social media, Facebook, wherever it is, WhatsApp groups, WhatsApp status, to help this message reach more people. This has been the Bites of Judaism podcast. This podcast has been made possible by Mr. and Mrs. David and Malki Smetana. If you found it valuable, please leave a 5-star rating and a review. It really does help it reach more people. And tell your friends about it. If you haven't yet, you can subscribe on all the major podcast platforms at rabbiglick.link/podcast. To dedicate a future episode of the podcast, send an email to podcast@rabbiglick.com. See you next time.